Barbara Hillers. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology colloquium series, which it is my pleasure to help coordinate with my dear colleague and friend, Fernando Orejuela. So thank you, Fernando, for helping with this and everything. So welcome to this event. I welcome folklorists and ethnomusicologists, but also any student or faculty from the Department of History that might have taken a chance on this, and the Jewish Studies program and the European Studies program, which leads me to the first of three things. Just three things I must not forget. First, very warm to our sponsors. We have 4 sponsors, starting with my home department, the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology. Wonderful, thank you for sponsoring this, and thank you, Dave, for being so enthusiastic from the start and finding the money in the budget somewhere. Thank you to the Department of History, who has co-sponsored it, instantly rose to the occasion when I asked them, the Institute of European Studies and the Ulamot Center for Scholarly and Cultural Exchange with Israel. Without the generous support of these sponsors, this event would not have been possible, and it certainly wouldn't have been possible to have a reception afterwards. Which brings me to thing number 2, I must not forget, which is to mention that there will be a reception, modest light reception, nonetheless a falafel reception, in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology. So when you come out, turn left, cross 3rd, up the stairs, falafel. Now, Guy Beiner. Professor Guy Beiner is full professor of history at Gurion University of the Negev, in Beersheba in Israel. But fortunately for us, he is this year the Burns Scholar at Boston College, and so we could afford to fly him in from Boston. So I'm not intending to give what my dear colleague Ray Cashman refers to as the full works of miracles, because Guy Beiner's full works of miracles are far too long. But we have to give a little bit of the vita and just a couple of miracles. So, Guy Beiner was born in Jerusalem. He is one of the last idealists in the country of Israel, witnessed by the fact that not only did he join the kibbutz, but then left it. He studied history as an undergraduate in Tel Aviv University, and then came to Dublin to do a MPhil in Irish studies, and one of his subjects was folklore, and he stepped into the archives of the National Folklore Collection. He worked with archival sources on the 1798 rising against British rule in Ireland, the United Irishmen Rising, and eventually graduated with a PhD in history from the National University of Ireland. So he's in this sense an Irish historian. Not quite the right accent, but since graduating some of the works and miracles, he has spent time at Notre Dame as a Kew Norton Institute of Irish Studies Fellow, as a Government of Hungary Fellow in Budapest. He spent a year in Oxford in the Faculty of History, and as I mentioned now, he is a Burns Scholar at Boston College. I have always had this strong sense of kinship with Guy ever since I came across his referring to the National Folklore Collections archive in Dublin as his Aladdin's Cave. And that really captured my experience. And even though I only met Guy first just over a year ago, when he gave the keynote at the Irish Conference for Folklore and Ethnology in Belfast, where this picture was from the National Folklore Collections photographic archive, was our poster. So I was delighted to see that he honors it by putting it up here today. I've called him an Irish historian, and he has certainly revolutionized, I think, the study of Irish history. But I also proudly claim him as an Irish folklorist. And to me, he is one of the most exciting contemporary scholars working on Irish folklore. He broke new ground for both history and folklore in his two works, Props. Prop 1, Remembering the Year of the French, Irish folk history and social memory. And Prop 2, more recently, Forgetful Remembrance, social forgetting and vernacular historiography of the rebellion in Ulster. These are the major miracles. He will speak about these works so much better than I can himself now, and which leads me to the third and absolutely final thing I must not forget, which is the title of his presentation, Unravelling a Folk History of Social Forgetting in Northern Ireland. So please welcome Beiner.
Thank you very much both to Barbara and to Ray for bringing me over. It's an extremely meaningful visit for me to come to Bloomington. You might sense this as I go along. It really is for me coming to a mythological place, which I have to kind of understand it's a real place because I've always heard about Bloomington, Indiana, and the folklore studies here, and I've read a lot about it, and I'm actually seeing it. And it's probably similar to certain people who used to go to Jerusalem and get Jerusalem syndrome. It's a different kind of notion. You come there and you're reading about these scriptures. You should read Mark Twain coming to the Holy Land, what he has to say about it. Very strange. Yeah, so the title you've just heard, Unravelling a Folk History of Social Forgetting in Northern Ireland. It's a title which I try to make accessible, but I actually think it would take me about half of the talk to actually explain the title. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Explain for the first half the title, and then I'll show some concrete examples. I've on purpose flagged folk history in grey, because that's the issue which I'm going to deal with. And it's a term which I would have changed, by the way, which is also problematic, and you'll see why as I go along. I use it because I thought it'd be more familiar. My notion in being invited here, and again, it's a huge sense of privilege to be here. We'll get a bit later to the picture of Peter McMullen on Rathlin Island, if we get to it. But my notion was that my mandate in coming here, my ticket, what won me the ticket to come here, much desired ticket, was that I should address the relationship of folklore and history. That was, I thought, what I was being asked to do, which is something which has preoccupied me ever since I was a student. So it's a good course of 2 decades. But it's also the most appropriate place I can think of in the world, definitely in North America, to address that question is exactly here in Bloomington, Indiana. And of course, one has to mention certain things, with a father kind of figure, which was always problematic because father figures are problematic inherently. That's what it is. We've all read Freud. But in that case, I've heard of Freud, some of us more than read it. But in that case, of course, we cannot not talk about folklore and history specifically here, and in general, I would say, without thinking of Richard Dawson, and a founding figure in many ways of the department, of the institute, of the journal, of all these kind of steps along the way. And there's a reverence which surrounds certain figures. When I try to think about it, I actually decided to use his own words in describing him. And this I remember from reading The British Folklore. It's a very important book for me, about the power and eloquence of these giants of folklore were never long out of my mind. So I think about these giants of folklore who are standing there. Except that, of course, the whole point of talking about founding figures and big figures from the past is the best tribute I think we can pay to them is not so much flattery, and not even imitation, which are usually the forms which you immediately go to. It actually is criticism. Yeah. The best way of engaging, I think the best academic tribute you can pay somebody is by critically engaging with their ideas. And maybe here I'm flogging a dead horse because it's a topic which raised too much criticism. But yet it's the one which we need to put on the table from the beginning. And that's, of course, the famous term, which Dawson himself was always aware that it caused controversy from the very beginning of folklore. From 1950, when it comes out as a review from the Treasury of American Folklore, he brought the term and he knew it would cause controversy. And the controversy came when he reflected in different ways. And he was touching on issues which are at the very heart of key debates, fundamental debates in folklore studies, of course. I mean, it should be obvious in this room. I don't need to dwell on it beyond other places. It's the kind of issues which often in the folklore tradition would be used with words of folklorismus. I'm not sure that folklore is exactly folklorismus, but that's a different point. It's close to it. And sometimes a term, not that much used in folklore studies, but often by people outside folklore, would try to even reduce it even further and say booklore. Is there a difference between folklore and booklore? We need to think about that a bit. And I will get to it a bit later, indirectly. But I'll just point, let's just see for a moment how Dawson himself defined the terms, because it's worth thinking of it. Folklore is the presentation of spurious and synthetic writings under the claim that they are genuine folklore. I often think that it's a key point. Yes, there are people who are generating things which were learned from oral tradition. They present it as such. It's not, you know, it's a dilemma, it's an issue we have to deal with. What is the relationship to that from things which are traditions which are passed on in other environments? It's a question which I think he flagged correctly. And he said quite clearly that he was using this term in a polemical sense, as a rallying cry against the distortion of a serious subject. He felt that folklore was in its early days as a discipline, and so he was using it in a way also to define the discipline. So is it still an archaic term? Is it still relevant now? I mean, we also, the framework, the context has changed. Important to remember that. The one point that I would like to flag, which is problematic, is the sense, which might come obvious. We've got to be careful of the notion of exceptionalism, especially American exceptionalism. There's of course a tradition to that. Was it really no parallel to that? It is kind of, it's typical to the United States of popularization, commercialization, mass media. At least today, everybody shares these concerns. And maybe always people share these concerns. It wasn't typically an American thing. So we'll start with that and just flagging that and return to it later. But then of course, one cannot deal with folklore and history and this relationship of folk history, Bloomington, Indiana, and in general, especially bringing it towards Ireland, without mentioning another great giant, happens to be in the room. It's very daunting to speak about a great giant who's in the room. It's intimidating. Though he's the least intimidating of people, perhaps, but still intimidating. And that's, of course, the great contribution of Henry Glassing, of Passing the Time in Ballymoney, which is a text which you could keep returning and returning and rereading. It's a monumental work, which, of course, afterwards, first of all, it could also be reduced. The pieces immediately after the selection of Irish folk history, which is a short version which focuses on the folk history of it. Passing the Time in Ballymoney is way beyond folk history. It's many, many things happening over the course of a year in one town and of stories that are collected from a community. But one bit specifically is used here, and this is a founding text for people who want to use as a source book of Irish folk history. And then, of course, the later book that comes out, The Stars of Ballymoney, which also comes very helpfully with the CD, so you can hear the sounds and the stories and the songs. And these are classic works of folk history. So I'm starting with this notion of folk history, and also with an awareness which Henry Glass's work has shown us. And people have followed in this line, and it's of course within a tradition. Another person sitting here, which is Ray himself, Ray Cashman, and it's the very notion of folklore fieldwork, that we go to collect these stories, and people are sometimes going to collect specifically historical oral traditions. You can hear many traditions when you go to collect in the field, but some people stumble on or directly go to seek historical traditions. So that's one way of accessing folk history, is an interest specifically in history as it appears in folklore. And fieldwork is a key. And I'll return to that if I complete the whole cycle that I want to do today. I've got to prepare quite a dense paper, we'll see how that goes. But if I manage to get through everything, I will return to that at the very end as well. But I would like to start with this notion of folk history as historical oral traditions. And I'm going to use this almost as a seminar. I didn't quite know what the turnout would be in this room. You'll see that the word turnout has significance as I go along. I didn't quite know what to do, so I thought I'd engage with specifically with ideas from the book which just came out a few months ago, so you'll hear quite a bit about this book. And in fact, this whole lecture is an infomercial, because I brought flyers from the publisher. I'm actually trying to sell them and peddling it around, as you can see. But in that sense, I'm going to quote the book and use that as a guiding text. So when I thought first about this notion of folk history, and this is thinking about it through different cases, the first point to be made is that folklore is many things. It's a whole world and many areas and many types. There's many genres and many forms and even many areas of interest. But within folklore, I believe that we should speak academically And it's interesting because we don't always treat that as a separate part of the syllabus. It's not always that it gets a course in its own right, but I believe it deserves its own area as a subfield. The notion that folk history is a subfield within folklore, within the wider world of folklore. And I'm saying this not because we as academics identify it as such, but because that's within the communities that we research. Ireland is a great example for that. If we take the example of Ireland, we'll find that there always were, if the famous word, there's many words for Irish storytellers, but the most popular one is Shanachie. If the word for storyteller is a Shanachie, there were certain Shanachies who specialized in telling historical tales. Sometimes their whole repertoire was only that. Sometimes it was the best of their repertoire. And those people deserve right, and they deserve recognition in their own right. I'd even give it a different name in some cases. These could be Star Oli. They could be the people who have knowledge of history specifically. That's what interested them. And they were recognized as such in their communities, as authority in the past. You want to know the past, you go to them. You want to hear jokes, you go to somebody else. You want to hear proverbs, you go to somebody else. There's a subdivision. It's not that somebody has to specialize in everything. And they specialize specifically in Shanachas, not in great fable lore, great stories, or even epic tales, but in pieces, usually shorter pieces, which are historically based. And it's important to recognize that as a subfield. And if we see that as a subfield, then we realize that that deserves recognition in its own right. However, I've increasingly moved away from the term folk history, and I want to explain why. After I've just argued for the legitimacy of the term folk history, that deserves recognition in its own right, I want to rethink it together with you. And I want to argue that perhaps we should be thinking in other terms of vernacular historiography. I'm going to spend a good part of the next section of the lecture dealing with this term and unpacking it, if I may. And again, I'm going to take a section of the book, because the book troubled me. Terminology I take very seriously. I think terminology is how we phrase our ideas, it's how we invest ideas and frame them. So we have to think about it critically at each stage. So, when I thought about this issue, I was weighing various alternatives. I'll show a passage from the book here, page 13. I was looking at different terms, and my original point was, and I just had a discussion with grad students before that, and we kind of dwelt on that. Initially, I wanted to break the division, which is quite often found in history, between myth and facts, between mythology and history. And I believe in this term, which I'm not the first to use. It's been used, it has a history in itself of myth history. We should be looking at this synthesis, how the two terms come together, how myths have a history, and how history itself can be told through stories, which could be spurious or could not be spurious, but they embody different subjective truths. But I had problems also with the term myth history and the way it's being used, and the baggage it carries, and also the fact that it didn't seem to gain currency. And I weighed different areas and fields of expertise which touch on the things which I was thinking about. So you can see here, and in the book I literally go into an introductory section by each term, and very concisely, each time it took weeks to phrase the paragraph, each paragraph, for each bit, but it was what is the strength of each field, and also what are its weaknesses and its baggage and its problematics. The terms that I considered, which are the kind of things that I'm dealing with, are living history, history from below, people's history, subaltern history, democratic history, ethno-history, popular history, public history, applied history, everyday history, shared history, grassroots history, local history, provincial history. Each one of these is a field, and you could add to that, could add a couple of others, but each one of these is an area which people have thought about, which takes it in a slightly different direction. Ethno-history is not quite the same as subaltern history, but the two share commonalities. Local history is not quite the same thing, but it might be share certain characters with it. And I looked at each one of these terms and said, maybe we should be thinking in those terms. And yet, like I say, each one of them carries its baggage. Each one of them comes with its traditions, with its problems, with its limitations. And so I suggested, after weighing all of these terms, perhaps we should be thinking in another term altogether, which is problematic. You've got so many terms, why throw another one into the arena? It has to have a reason to do that. Not just to make your mark, but to think about it. And the term I'm suggesting, we're trying to reach folk history, right? But I'm saying folk history might not be the right term. Might not be the best term. I'll explain. I would suggest we have to think in vernacular historiography. Vernacular historiography, or vernacular history, if we start off with vernacular history, has been used in the past. Often in its most immediate sense. Medievalists have used it. In the most immediate sense of separating between history which is written in the official language, Latin, And that was written in demotic languages, so that other people could read it, not just this caste of scholars who speak a language which only they can speak. Priests and scholars who go aside with it. So it's kind of opening it up. So that's the one sense. But I would like to suggest that vernacular history could be an umbrella term in a way, and even more than an umbrella term, to take all these various unconventional histories that I mentioned before, all these histories which take issue with what is supposed to be conventional mainstream history, and it incorporates what I would say are the fortes of all of them in various forms, while it also adds something new, which is what we need to think of, which we bring in from folk history and other places. Because of this, it's so attuned to speech, to language, that it also forces us, speaking about the language of vernacular, it forces us to think about native languages, regional dialects, colloquial registers. So it puts speech at the center. Speech and local customs at the center of how we deal with history in all its various demotic forms. So I'm starting with that. So why, if I'm saying this term seems to have a lot of resonance, but still, why not use folk history? Folk history can be the same, it can be synonymous. I mean, we don't need another term. And I'll try and explain that. I think part of the baggage of folk history, coming from folklore, is that folklore has, even though it recognizes that it's a problem, and this place knows it more than any other place. I'm speaking again, it's preaching to the converted in many ways. But folklore somehow has this trapping, even if we try to avoid it, of separating literary and oral cultures. We know that there have been interactions between the two, and yet we're saying folklore going to privilege the oral. And there's a certain problem in that. There's a certain problem as I see it, because I don't think we can. From the moment the advent of writing has been on the scene, we can't separate them anymore. So much so that when I think about it, even the most oral accounts in a society that has writing will have some influence and impact of writing in it. And even if we think we collected it from somebody who's completely illiterate and hasn't been corrupted by writing, let's just remember what we do. Often when we go there, not only do we see this interplay with subtle written sources which can appear in many various forms, but even in the action that we do ourselves, the ethnographic action itself, we go there, we collect it, we write down our notes, and even if we just record it, we've got the pure audio sound, we make a transcript afterwards. We turn it into writing. So writing is there all the time. And the interactions between the oral and the literary are there all the time. They interplay into each other. What I did a lot in the first book was to show how a story can originate as an oral story and then appear in print and then return again to orality and then go back into print, and they can play on each other all the time. Hence, vernacular, I tried to explain before why I think vernacular is such an important term, with its coming towards the local custom and local speech and nuance. But historiography I particularly like, because historiography, inbuilt in its etymology, this connection between history and writing. And I think that's important, because we should try and think about it in terms of orality as well. Can there be an oral historiography? Seems like an oxymoron. Oral historiography, graphy, we've got writing, but it's not an oxymoron, as I see it. Because accounts are told, they're retold over time, they're written, they return into orality, they're written again, they change over time, we document them at different moments. That's the point that I'm trying to make you why I think vernacular historiography is useful. It's the retelling and the redocumentation and the recollecting and the circular, or this influence as they feed into each other. And something else. And again, Henry's presence in the room is crucial for this. The notion that Henry didn't always use just vernacular for speech, but also for things which are non-narrative in their essence. If the stories are told about how we can bring in not just the literary sources, but also the non-textual historical representations which can appear in material culture or visual culture. And so vernacular historiography, I think, in advance says all of this has to appear in our scope. Whereas folklore had a privilege towards one area with folk history. It's not that folk history doesn't do that, but I'm saying let's leave that term aside with its traditions for a moment and think in terms of vernacular historiography. Historians might say, folklorists I think wouldn't see that necessarily, but coming from history would say, vernacular historiography, that's all great, but isn't that a hidden history? How do you access it? Historians know where to find history. You find it in an archive, supposedly. But vernacular historiography, it's everything that's outside the archive. Well, the first point to make, of course, and this is a point which is well known by now, we've seen this for decades now, is of course there's plenty of vernacular historiography to be found in the archive, right? It's all about reading history against the grain. Once we do that, we read history against the grain, we'll find that it's full of references to vernacular historiography in the archive. And then the challenge is to go beyond the traditional archive, to look at other archives, to look at things outside. And invariably that will lead us to many places, but it will also lead us towards popular print. It will lead us towards popular print, towards provincial newspapers and chapbooks and ephemeral kind of material as they come out. These are great sources which documented local traditions which could have been oral and appeared in print and will reappear again in orality. These are great things. But once we follow that kind of path and acknowledge print, then we can no longer accept any kind of analysis in which folklore, if folklore goes hand in hand with popular print, then folklore becomes a slightly less useful category. Because folklore insists on driving this wedge between the literary and the oral. But if they're interplaying all the time, it's all about creating new folklores and turning them into folklore, and how they integrate in different forms. So that's the point I wanted to start off with. The point that folklore accounts, and one of the particular value, often found remarkable. So let's say we find a classic example of folklore. We find something which is completely spurious in the classic sense of the word. It's an author sitting and inventing a tradition, and he writes it in print. And in the 1950s, people might have been afraid, but people will think that's how people see Johnny Appleseed. Just by that, right? They don't see the traditions that were there before. But within a short time, people will be telling the stories that they read in that print and enter into folklore. Folklore can often be fantastic from the point of view of a cultural historian for reception, how people receive these stories and readapt them and recreate them to something new. It's not a passive action. Reception we think is, I received it, that's it, you know, I'm subservient. It never is it like that. It's always about readapting it and relocating it and changing it and challenging it and turning it into something new. So it's a transformative moment, which is remarkable. And it's these interaction again between print and oral culture which are crucial, which I find so fertile in vernacular historiography. That's the first thing I wanted to flag as I go along here. The second thing I wanted to flag, and that's why I marked in grey folk history, which would have been vernacular historiography. I didn't want to throw that term on you without first explaining how I got to it and what I mean by it. I don't want it to be enigmatic in any way. The second point is, what does this mean to memory? I have used in the past, very rarely, I think it has to be for specific situations, we could talk about folk memory. But I prefer to use the term social memory, or even better, social remembering, as a verb rather than a noun, as a process. But what does social forgetting mean? That's a bizarre one. And that's something I need to explain, how I got to social forgetting and why I think it's an area which is well worth our dwelling on. Social memory is a very familiar term by now. When I had to argue its case a decade or so ago, I had to make a case more than a decade and a half ago. I think now it's been accepted more or less, but for social forgetting I have to explain. So let me try and explain the relationship between social forgetting and social remembering. And to make it easy or fast, I'll do it simply by putting these two books next to each other and letting them talk to each other. I'll sit on the side and let them talk. But the way we'll do that is actually putting the two covers there. And you can see, in a way, my own trajectory, because these ideas have plagued me the whole time in writing these two books and pausing in between and thinking. If we look at the two books and we try and play a game, let's spot the differences. So if we play a game of spot the difference to shorten it, had it been a group, we would have actually done that. We would have sat back, we would have spotted them. But even the subtitles, so this one is about folk history and social memory. Already then I used vernacular historiography, but I felt more comfortable with the term folk history. It was more familiar, it was easier to explain, I didn't have to stop too much. So here I used much more the word folk history, and I talked about social memory. And in the new book, I've insisted on speaking more about vernacular historiography and social forgetting. And to explain this difference, rather than talking about words, I also want to demonstrate what I mean by using vernacular historiography in different sources, which are not necessarily textual or narrative. Let's look at the images of both books for a minute. Both images are from approximately the same time, the Fan de Siècle period in Ireland. The one on the left is a remarkable, unpublished private collection sketched by Jack B. Yeats, the brother of William Butler Yeats, the Nobel Prize poet. you don't introduce people through their brothers or through their parents. He's a great artist in his own right. So this is a way, a picture of the artist as a young man. He's one of Ireland's great modernist, impressionist, expressionist painters. But here we're going to see him as a young man doing a sketch. He's in the west of Ireland, in County Sligo, sketching a commemorative event. And on the other hand, there's a lesser known illustrator from the same period, sketching something else. This is an event to commemorate, the one on the left, the 1798 rebellion. I'll get to that in a minute, in the west of Ireland. And the one on the right, it's not clear what's happening, but it's called The Memory of the Dead. And The Memory of the Dead is a ballad about 1798. And the settings are different in each one. So let's consider each one briefly in their own right. We'll start with the one on the left, the first book. Ray, you told me you teach sometimes from the back of the class, is that correct?
Let's try to get to see what people are actually searching for when they're searching.
I'm dealing this from the back of the class, for the back of the auditorium, for a simple reason. Look at how the artist chooses. It's from the back. This is what fascinates me more than anything else about this remarkable painting, is it's a commemoration. We have endless depictions of commemorative events and endless photos. Almost always, the way historians look at it and the way we're tempted to look at it is by focusing on the stage. The TV cameras, when you see an event, focus on the speaker, on the president speaking, on whoever's there on the front stage, and we get this talk of what they're saying. But what's remarkable here is it's taken from the back, literally from the back. It's not even from the back of the front, it's from the back of the back, from behind the scenes. And you see this great array of people and flags and banners and heraldry and symbols and flags. And even here we see from the back the speaking, which says, "Who fears to speak of 98?" And who fears to speak of 98, in this case 498, is the lines of the ballad, The Memory of the Dead, from the other picture, which we'll return to in a minute. Remember here, on this uniform. And look at gender as well. There's hardly any woman you can spot here, but there is a woman very prominently in the front. In the book itself, when I looked at these events, I tried to find narratives from the point of view. There's a remarkable ceremony nearby in another community where they do a similar event, where a reporter was in the back and heard women speaking about the fact that a woman gets on the stage and how meaningful it was for them. Because here we only see men on the stage. And that's how I see, more or less, social memory. Is this interaction of people interacting and remembering together and how it passes back. It's almost a scene, think of it, the best cinematographic representation I can think of is the life of Brian. The Sermon on the Mount is shown in Monty Python's The Life of Brian. So people are sitting in the back and trying to hear the Sermon on the Mount. And what is he saying there? Blessed are the cheesemakers. Why are cheesemakers? They're trying to work it out for themselves. Maybe it means dairy products in general. The Greek will inherit the earth. Why the Greek? And it's just fabulous. So it's always about spurious knowledge going through and being reworked and finding meaning in it. So that's the one picture. This I see as an example of social, I mean by social remembrance. The second one is something different. We're in a room. We're indoors. We're sitting in the room. We're sitting in on a room. We're not at the back of something public. Are there any windows? It's a cottage. Again, look at the gender aspect here. The men are on one side, the woman is on the other side. There's a tune being played. You know, it's quite meaningful. The instrument itself is an interesting depiction of a piper. So there's a pipe. Maybe playing The Memory of the Dead, the ballad, maybe not. There might be talk that we're not seeing any lips necessarily moving. It's a very silent form of engaging with the memory of the dead, while also vocal. There's tunes, there's music, there might be song, there might be talk, but it's muted, it's quiet. And that's the scene I want to work on and understand better. So this is what we're going to be looking at in a bit closer, and why images sometimes tell us other stories which we wouldn't see otherwise. So, just to kind of recount again my own trajectory in the story between these two books, which have been talking to each other, and I'm just trying to hear them from the back of the road there. But in the earlier book, and they both touched on similar subjects, I looked at what historians call, this is history with a capital H, the Great Irish Rebellion of 1798, a major episode in modern Irish history. It will be Ireland's chapter in the age of revolutions, of Atlantic revolutions. So there's the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Irish want-to-be revolution, which didn't succeed, which is a rebellion because of that. Except, and the 98 becomes a big term in Irish history, like the 45 in Scotland. It's a big thing, right? So we've got 98. Now, a lot of folklore about 98, what's called its main arena in history books around Wexford. A lot of talk about it. So the point I wanted to make again is provincial history. Let's go away and hear the echoes. Let's look at other places. And I went specifically in the first book and looked at the west of Ireland, at Connacht. An episode which for most history books were covered this episode in one sentence. And as one historian said, the strange episode of the Republic of Connacht and the rebellion in the west of Ireland was a footnote to history. That's closed, it's a footnote, you don't need to talk about it anymore. You can sum it up in a paragraph saying, there was a small French invasion, they arrived too late, too little, rebels joined them, they were defeated. End of story. Except that I began looking at the folklore of it. That for a whole area of the west, well into the middle of Ireland, this was the most significant event in their modern past. It had a name of its own, Blian of Rankach, the year of the French, and the year of the French had huge significance. So what might seem to somebody in Dublin or somebody in London as something insignificant, for them was hugely significant. And it generated a whole body of folk. And ultimately, it also generated its own commemoration. So here's a ceremony, a local ceremony, 100 years later, to dedicating a monument on French Hill, outside Castle Bar. Now, here I have to do another pause for a minute, and take another of these kind of hobby horses, which is too easy to kind of knock down, but it's worth thinking about it before saying it's too easy, because there is value in this kind of argument and going back to it. The easiest way to explain this kind of thing, the way most historians would have felt comfortable dealing with the past, was to treat this as an invention of tradition. So people had their own traditions, but in the end, they see that the way it's done in modern circumstances is through monuments. So they had their own folklore, but that doesn't really matter that much to the story. And then the monuments come over, and then it becomes commemoration. That's a new subject. And so in 1898, 100 years later, all over Ireland, there's ceremonies to mark the centenary. And so the local people copy on the model. Again, commercialization, cultural influence, print, it's all happening here. Except, if we treat this vernacular historiography in its own right and realize that it has a history of its own, if we look back and find that the centenary commemoration in 1898 is not the first commemoration on the first site. In fact, the monument itself was erected 20 years earlier by local people who were aware that there's a local tradition. Since 1798, the place was called French Hill because people remembered that French soldiers had died there in a skirmish. And so, in 1876, their grandchildren identified the same spot. They went there, they dug, and they found skeletons with French uniform. And so they erect a monument. And so in 1898, they're not copying what's happening around Ireland, they're finding new meaning to reinvent their tradition, to regenerate their tradition. And that's often how it works. Not necessarily always, but quite often what we're talking about is not pure invention, but reinvention. Or a word that I prefer to use increasingly, regeneration. And so it should be, because if traditions are not being regenerated, they will ultimately die. Folklore is not a game of pass the parcel, as I say it. It's not, here is the past, take it, pass it to the next generation. When the music stops, it will keep going around until the music stops. It doesn't work like that. You take it over and you change it as you take it. Each transmission will change it, will readapt it, will make it something new. Hence this notion of historiography, vernacular historiography, we have to document the changes each time, if we can, from the point of view of history, and see how it changes in different contexts each time. So it's all about regeneration of tradition. And indeed, in the first book, I found the sources were ample. And yet it was tricky in many ways, because I had a huge amount of sources collected by the Irish Folklore Commission in the 1930s and 40s, and by the schools collection collected by children around Ireland. But I wanted to know what was there before that. I wanted to go and look at works of antiquarians who had collected things before that, people like Thomas Crofton Croker, who had travelled around and collected songs illustrative of the French invasion. He didn't speak the Irish language, he had to have it translated for him, so it was already being mediated and changed, and if you wish, reinvented as it was happening. But in the community, over the years, even before the folklore collectors arrived, of course, there were local history tellers. There was the Staroli we were telling you about before. Like this fellow over here, James O'Neill of Crowdromin. So when the folklore collectors come over, they hear, oh, this is a story that James O'Neill used to say. Or the school children will hear that their grandparents had heard it from James O'Neill. So just one example. And later also, it's interesting, a historian, hardly recognized in the canon of Irish historiography, a man called Richard Hayes, wrote a history of this episode in 1937 and travelled along the route of the French army and collected oral traditions. So the folklore collectors were collecting traditions as folklorists. He was collecting as an historian. Suddenly we had all these traditions that I realized in the 1930s and people before that And I tried to retrace this kind of historiography. It was tricky, but I focused on social remembrance. In the other book, the exercise is different. I need to explain the historical reference to explain why it's different. So I'm going to do a little bit of history for a minute, just so we understand what I'm on. We'll see the specifics of it. The other book, I did other projects in between, and then I decided to return to 1798 again, but not to where I was expected to return, to the main arena of preoccupation, what we call, say, collective memory, Wexford, and not Connacht, which I covered already. You can always go back, but actually go up north, to counties Antrim and Down, to Ulster. And why is this particularly interesting? And this is interesting indeed. Because if this rebellion was planned by the United Irishmen, the secret society of the United Irishmen, the founders of the United Irishmen were particularly from the north areas of Ireland, from northeast areas even of Ulster. How do you track a secret society? Very difficult. There are ways of doing it. Also, as an historian, one way, for example, is they had a newspaper. We can see where they distributed their own newspaper. Who subscribed to their newspaper? Concentrated exactly in the north and the northeast. The founding members of the secret society of the United Irishmen, people like Dubliners, even like Wolfe Tone, who's considered the father of Irish republicanism. Wolfe Tone sees that he has to go up north to Belfast to convene other radicals like him, and they go to a cave. It's a founding kind of mythological moment in Irish republicanism. They go to this cave hill above Belfast, and they swear an oath in 1795 never to desist until Ireland will be free again. This is the founding of Irish republicanism, taking the ideas of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and bringing it to Ireland, how they'll bring together Protestants, Catholics, and dissenters. Because the great majority of the founding figures of this society up in the northeast, are Presbyterians, or dissenters as they would be called at the time. People from Scottish background. These are Ulster Scots. Some of them immigrated over here and played a key role in the American Revolution. These are the Ulster Scots who stayed behind. Influenced by correspondence, of course, but it's a different thing, a different story, and a different path to follow. So we've got this backbone of a revolutionary moment, of a revolutionary movement, or Presbyterians of Ulster Scots heritage. They're going to join Catholics and Protestants from the established church in a rebellion. Often, people say this rebellion is insignificant. Historians would say the main thing again was Wexford. And maybe guys now convinced us Connacht. But why the north? The north finished in a week. It only had a couple of excursions. The moment you begin to look, you find there was battles all over Antrim and Down. It was a massive event. Maybe it lasted a week, but that week is the bloodiest event by far in Northern Irish history of the last 3 centuries. By far, much beyond the troubles that we've seen now the last 30 years. And it all happened in a week. Engagements such as, for example, Antrim Town. Antrim Town is this attack on a town. This is an again, I want to show we can use vernacular sources. This is an antiquarian who specializes in using oral traditions to try and make them become graphic. Carey, there's the brothers Carey, there are 2 brothers, they do these antiquarian drawings. So this is him trying to reconstruct the Battle of Antrim from oral traditions. But there's something here which I want to dwell on for a minute, which will show us part of the conundrum that is here. Let's look at another big battle that happened there, maybe the biggest battle, the last big battle of the rebellion in the north. We're going to go from County Antrim down to County Down to Ballinahinch. Here's a contemporary painting of this battle. This is again history with a capital H. In fact, it's even following a model. For those who might, a model scheme, if you wish. For those who want to know what the influence is, some of you might have seen Benjamin West's classic picture of the death of General Wolfe. Very famous moment. It's modeled on that, quite consciously. So an artist from the period is drawing this kind of a death of a British commander in a battle against these savages out there. Irish rebels, you hardly see them. They're on the background. They're not part of history. Notion of winners and losers in history. The people who are in the forefront of the history are the military in the front. They're going to write the narratives of it. Though there is one rebel here significantly. Over here, this fellow can be identified as Hugh McCulloch. He's a United Irish colonel who's going to be hung on a windmill very shortly after a court-martial. And if we look at this picture beyond the military, trying to understand what's happening with the masses here, there are thousands upon thousands of Presbyterians who show up that day for battle, knowing that they might pay the ultimate price, many did, Many of them showing up in their Sunday best for an event which was extremely significant for them and being crushed in a rebellion. However, once this rebellion ends, quite shortly and quite brutally, let's remember that Great Britain at the time was also in a wider conflict with the French revolutionary armies, which will develop into the Napoleonic Wars afterwards. Britain had to find a quick solution to this problem of this rebellion in its backyard. And the solution was found as a political solution. It was the Act of Union. Immediately after this rebellion, maneuvers are made to restructure Ireland's position and its relationship with England. And the solution is essentially that Britain annexes Ireland. So they create a new unit. You can see it through the flags, but it's not through the flags. That's how they create the flag that we know today. But the notion is that they create the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. A country which will exist till 1920, where it will change its name after partition, and it will become the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And that's the full name of the UK today. I mention that because sometimes we forget it. Most English people forget it. They were reminded by Brexit very recently. It seemed that they were just the United Kingdom. And they could say clearly, it's very easy to leave Europe because we're just an island. We don't have any land border with Europe. Except, of course, they do, Northern Ireland. Now, what's interesting from the point of view, what I'm saying here is that these Republican rebels, Presbyterians, there'll be a mass shift in their political allegiance of many of these communities. They will find their place within the Union. Catholics will not get emancipation for another 3 decades. But all Protestants will be offered equal rights here. So Presbyterians will suddenly become part of the establishment. And there'll be a rush of people moving from republicanism towards unionism, towards loyalism. Now, this is very interesting. Because what we're seeing here is if we return to the same area of that battle a few years later into the 19th century, throughout the 19th century, we'll find that the rebels, and afterwards the children of the rebels, and afterwards the grandchildren of the rebels, most likely will be taking part in displays of loyalism towards the crown, not rebels against the crown. Many of them will join the Orange Order, which is an ultra-loyalist organization that celebrates the victories of the Protestants over the Catholics in the 17th century. They're not going to mark a rebellion in the 18th century. And this will continue till today. The bastion, the core group of the Orange Movement, every year on the 12th of July, if you want to see processions, go to Antrim and Down. That's where you'll see, here's Ballynahinch in 2012. So the same place where these people, their ancestors might have been rebels, many of them might have been rebels, many of them are now loyalists. Now what does this mean for memory? If, before I was talking about remembering 1798, something is happening here. Rather than remembering, we're engaging here in disremembering. People have a vested interest not to remember that their ancestors, or they themselves, and afterwards their ancestors, were rebels. Now, disremembering sounds like a great postmodernist term, right? We all like to add these prefixes and suffixes to our writing. Think again. Vernacular historiography is very helpful in this regard, so we have to pay attention to language, didn't I? So let's look at glossaries of Ulster speech as documented by folklore collectors. Quite interesting. 1880. A glossary of words in use in counties of Antrim and Down. Disremember is the local word used for to forget. And even better, another glossary from the early 20th century looking at local colloquial speech. Disremember is to forget, be unable to recall. It also means something else, and this is where the subtleties of folk speech come in. It also means pretend to forget, be unwilling or inclined not to remember. Now, this is something else. This is something interesting. It's one thing to forget and not remember. It's another thing is to pretend to forget. So maybe what you're seeing here is not necessarily what I thought I would see when I come here. It's not collective amnesia, a community that forgets something completely and you don't find it. But it's something else. And what is that something? I suggest we think of it in terms of social forgetting. I'll briefly explain social forgetting, but what it requires, beyond anything else, is paying attention to silence. Let's listen to silence as we go along. Now, there's a lot to say here and my time is running, so I'm going to try and do this quickly. But we want to pay attention to silence again. Folklore does it right. I'm going to do some theory here quickly, but fortunately for all of us, folklore has taught us the theory doesn't have to be something that we make impenetrable to others. There's vernacular theory as well. As Dorothy Noyes taught me more than anything else, there can be humble theory, right? So it doesn't have to be, we can break these terms into simple terms. And in fact, I would argue that there are vernacular cultures of silence, just as there are vernacular cultures of speech. And what do I mean by that? Well, Northern Ireland will help me explain this very, very quickly. Because Ulster, Northern Ireland is the place to look for it among many places, but it is ideal for it. Poets seem to get it. For example, let's look at Bertie Rogers. This is great. Bertie Rogers, who talks about the people of Ulster being those who bristle into reticence at the sound of the round gift of the gab in southern mouths. So Ireland is known for its loquacity, for its gift of the gab. But Ulster is known for the fact that people bristle into reticence. They don't like to speak too much. Seamus Heaney, another poet laureate, captured it beautifully in a poem, which is a local idiom, that says it all. Whatever you say nothing. That's a way of saying something, isn't it? And he talks in that same poem about northern reticence, the tight gag of place, O land of password, hand grip, wink and nod, where tongues lie coiled, whispering walls. So things are being said, but they're said quietly, and in different symbols and different forms. So if oral history and oral traditions fed into us this big wave of memory studies, if we would pay the same kind of respect to reticence, maybe we'd get into forgetting stories. A field which is waiting to come into itself. And what that might lead us to is into social forgetting. And what I mean by social forgetting is not collective forgetting and not total amnesia. It's not that somebody presses delete on the computer and everything is forgotten. It's not that that doesn't happen. Things can be completely forgotten, except that if something is completely forgotten, I have nothing to say about it. It's been completely forgotten. Maybe most of history is completely forgotten. That's of a little slight interest to me. You could say it's missing, that's all I can say. But in many cases, what we will find when we dig deep into something which seems to have been forgotten, we might find, I'll switch this up instead, we might find that under a facade of public oblivion, behind reticence, if we listen very carefully, we might find private recollections. We might find muted recollections. We might find private remembrance. And social forgetting, as I see it, is actually a form of remembrance. It's a remembrance that thrives on this tension between silence in public and talking within various spheres which are intimate. Some of these spheres can be actually public as well, just outsiders don't get them. So it's about in-groups and out-groups. And that's a whole other agenda which we can look at both as folklorists and as historians, I believe. And again, we can ask the simple question, how do you uncover it? If it's so private, isn't it hidden? But I already gave you the key for that one. How do we uncover it? Through vernacular historiography. We began looking at the sources, because there's always sources of these things. And I was particularly fortunate to choose, not fortunate, it took me years to choose it, and I chose it deliberately. I chose an area which had been incredibly documented. When I first went there, people told me you'll find much less traditions. Ireland has been well researched in terms of folk tradition, but in Northern Ireland, much less. You need to be like Henry, to sit there for a year, or like Ray, for a year and collect these traditions. But not quite so. Because in many cases, as an historian, when I look at it, I realized that these areas had been highly literate. They had an oral culture, but they also had literacy. Maybe because they were Presbyterians, but also the Catholics, they were very literate. There might be dual influence here. And what I found was that every few years there'd be a local minister, or a school teacher, or a traveler that traveled through the area, or an antiquarian, or a visitor, or a tourist, or somebody who would go by and document local traditions, and somehow always they reference this event privately. So I could trace an oral historiography, a vernacular historiography, of traditions over more than 2 centuries. And where does this lead us? Ray, can I take 10 minutes?
Sure.
What I'll do now is give a few brief examples. To give you many examples, it took me 700 pages, it's in the book. The 700 pages are not comprehensive. There's many, many more examples. Strange that it may seem, I had to choose for each case. There were multiple examples. I ended up I went looking for a place where people told me there would be nothing, and I found more than I can comprehend. I found thousands upon thousands of sources. That's why it took more than a decade. I tested another decade. It would be double the sources. But let me give some examples. And here's a good one. Euphemisms. Oh, land of password, nod, and wink. Let's look at it. So let me give you a couple of examples as I go along. How you decipher a euphemism. This gentleman over here is Samuel McSkimming. Samuel McSkimming, not well known among historians necessarily, was a shopkeeper in the town of Carrickfergus in County Antrim. Shopkeeper, humble man. And yet, he was the #1 expert on traditions of County Antrim. He's an antiquarian, he collects traditions, and he wrote about the history and antiquities of Carrickfergus in his area. What's remarkable is he doesn't mention 1798 in the 2 editions of this book. So didn't he pick up on it at all? We might think so. except we need to dig further. And what we find out is that Samuel McSkillen was obsessed with 1798. He came from a town further north called Ballyclare, where he was chased out of it because he was accused of being an informer on United Irishmen. So he escapes to Carrickfergus. To Carrickfergus, to seek legitimacy, he joins the Yeomanry, which is a local paramilitary group which chases rebels. And he hunts down rebels. And this sits heavy on his heart. And he'll spend the rest of his life, he's a loyalist, living in a loyalist community. He'll spend the rest of his life going around plying people with drink, so they get drunk and sing for him songs about the rebellion and tell him stories, and he documents them. But he can't bring himself to publish it, because you can't bring this out in public. So he's collecting traditions all the way to his deathbed. He confesses on his deathbed that the worst thing he ever did in his life was he was sent on a mission with a fellow yeomanry to destroy a local book club in a village called Durk. Durk's where he learned to read and write. That was his own library, which he had to destroy because it was seen as a radical book club. So he had to ruin the books that had taught him his own trade, what he really believes in. He later writes his Annals of Ulster, carefully guided, which is a history of 1798 in Antrim. And even that was a problem for him, because he had to couch it as a loyalist book. He had to show that the rebels are wrong the whole time. Even though in other writings he describes how he travels, using as pseudonyms the whole time. It took me a while to decipher this. He travels to the areas where the rebellion had happened, and he breaks out crying in places. He's so sympathetic, his friends died. And yet, he writes about in loyalist terms, and you have to dig and see how he mentions things. And here's just a telling example. In speaking of the insurrection, it is very rarely called a rebellion. This is buried in a footnote on page 112. But commonly the turnout, the call used at the time to those who appeared tardy to come forth to the ranks. This phrase more or less epitomizes social forgetting. You don't use the term, you don't call it a rebellion, you use an ambiguous term like the turnout. And it's rebels who were reluctant, they didn't really want to go, they just had to. That's how you couch it. And this comes again and again. I can give numerous examples. I'll run through this quickly. I'll just give one example, one more of exactly this thing, of the turnout. Old Ballymena. Old Ballymena, the Ballymena Telegraph, a local newspaper in a town in Antrim, decides to write a history of its own folklore. It says, does anybody have folk traditions of our area? We'd love to publish them. But we don't want anything political and anything controversial. Yeah. We're a loyalist community. And people begin bringing stories of 1798. No, we don't want that. And more stories of 1798. No, we don't want that. Okay, we'll put them in one chapter. And in a second chapter, and a third chapter. And when they make a book out of it, more than half of it is 1798 traditions, which they have to stop at some stage. Let's move on to other things. So people are obsessed with it, but they didn't talk about it publicly before that, because it was incorrect to talk about it. And when they deal with it again, they say, it's seldom called an insurrection. It's a turnout. Why? Because they were misguided. They were comparatively innocent. They were in the horns of a dilemma. They were compelled. They were compelled. Tens of thousands of people wear their Sunday best to take part in a rebellion. That's how the rationals afterwards. A rebellion is inconvenient. Folklore can tell us so much about the way you phrase things and bury things. While you're telling the tale, you're burying it at the same time. You're telling it and covering it at the same time, which is remarkable. And if you want one more example of the same thing of vernacular historiography, just to see how it plays, it sometimes is found in unexpected places altogether. So I looked a lot at vernacular poetry, which is remarkable. Poetry in the dialect of Ulster Scots dealt a lot with 1798. And the notion was you could even publish this poetry, but people won't understand it, so it's fine. Authorities are not looking at it. But sometimes you find, I found a lot of remarkable poems, but sometimes you find them in unexpected places. This really bored me out. Adam Lynn is not known for any Republican sympathies. He's mostly doesn't write political poetry. When he did, his poetry was about the Orange Order. He was a member of the Orange Order. And so he publishes in the local unionist paper. Ballymena, he's in Cullybackey, he published in the Ballymena Telegraph. He published a poem originally, which was called The 12th of July. The 12th of July means the 12th of July. So it's about Orange Festival celebrating the victories of the Crown over Catholic rulers, Protestants against Catholics. And when you read, so I thought this poem would have no interest in me. First time I read the book, I said, no interest, moving on. And it troubled me, so I had to go back. Then I reread this poem. Not the best at Ulster Scots here, definitely not at pronouncing it, but let's give it a try. Few of us minna true not fecht. They're taking a place here in 98. I wouldn't like to be our sprecht, but you'll ken. The civil side had neither wecht for sugar men. Whether it's a language or not, I'll leave it to yourselves, because we can decipher it for ourselves. That's a political issue in Ireland. But let's work out the dialect with what we know using, if you read Robbie Burns, you can And Walter Scott, you're already familiar with this kind of stuff, but let's go through lowland kind of Scots dialect. Few of us men comes from the low Scots to remember. Few of us remember the turn out fecht. So now we know how it's pronounced, the turn out. Few of us remember the turn out, which was fought, that took place here in 98. I don't want to exaggerate what I'm saying about it, but you all know that the civil side, the people, never had a chance against the soldiermen. So it's a poem about the 12th of July. It mentions 1798 and says few of us remember 1798 because it was a doomed rebellion. So it's a poem about not remembering 1798, that's how it remembers it. And that's how social forgetting works. It supposedly doesn't remember and remembers it when it remembers. It covers it up as it's telling it. It's a different variant of folklore in that sense. We'll run through a few other examples quickly just to show this kind of variety of sources. Material culture. You can't not mention material culture again in the room, you just can't. But even this can be remarkable in some senses. So I was looking for graves of rebels, and most of the rebels were buried in communal pits. There's no graves. And there's a lot of vernacular landscape of stories told about rebels' graves in different places. But in some few cases I actually found graves, which seemed to be interesting. But then there were problems. And the problems is what make them even more interesting. So this grave is outside the Presbyterian Church in Saintfield in County Down. It's the grave of John Laurie, who died in the 19th of June, 1798. It says so in stone. Did he really die on the 17th of June, 1798? Because if I go to vernacular historiography, I find a different story. I find this character over here, Reverend Thomas Ledley Birch, a radical Presbyterian minister who ministered to the rebels before the engagement at Saintfield, the day before the Battle of Ballynahinch, which we saw before. He talks to the rebels and he gives them a sermon to send them out enthusiastically to battle. Afterwards, he's pursued by the authorities, he's arrested, he's court-martialed, he's supposed to be hanged. His brother intervenes. His brother is an officer, an army officer, gets him released on the condition that he emigrates to America. He leaves the courtroom, an orange mob attack him, they try to lynch him. He barely escapes with the skin of his teeth. He arrives in America, and the first thing he does when he comes to Philadelphia is he writes down his memory of the rebellion. But he can't publish it under his own name, even though he's an American, because he wants to send it back. So he writes it as an immigrant letter home. That's how it's phrased. And if we go through that text, we'll find among whom bravely fell Mr. John Lowry of Ardbellan at the Battle of Saintfield, which happened on 9th of June, 1798. So did his family forget the date? Or did they try to disguise the date? The community knew well the day that he died. They knew what event he happened and how it happened. But on the grave, you have to present it differently. You have to date it 10 days later. They began finding grave after grave, the same pattern. The dates had been changed, so that outsiders would come and say, oh, we didn't have any involvement in it. You could tell outsiders, but for yourselves, you knew very well how it happened. Another quick example. I'm going to go through this quickly, because there's too many of them. But here, this notion of the generation, I love this notion, the generation of social forgetting. It works on two levels. Generation because of the people who started these traditions of social forgetting. But also generation as a generational thing. What happens with that generation and the next generation? It's both generating and generation. I want to introduce you to two remarkable characters. The woman on the left there is Mary Ann McCracken, the sister of Henry Joy McCracken, the leader of the rebels in Antrim town. We saw the Battle of Antrim in the very beginning. A radical woman, in many ways, who will live a long life, unlike her brother who will be executed, and will be involved in campaigns for abolition against slaves, many radical causes in Belfast town. She'll reconcile with the Act of Union. She won't be a rebel. She'll live through the Act of Union, be a mild unionist, and yet her whole life will be about remembering her brother and the rebels of 1798. She'll always wear dark clothes. The windows in her house will always be closed, except on St. Patrick's Day it will be open. All the rest of the time they'll be talking stories, and people who are congregating in her house will be the former rebels who somehow survived. People like this man over here, James Hope, who led a column of soldiers in the Battle of Antrim. And he'll come back to this house again and again, and between them quietly they'll talk about these stories. But they can't get them out. Towards the end of their life, they'll experience what I would call post-memory anxieties. This is how I use post-memory, a bit different from Marianne Hirsch. But post-memory anxieties because they're about to die. They've lived long lives, both of these people, but their secrets are going to go with them to the grave. And they're worried. The last Holocaust survivors, who's going to document them? The last veterans of World War II. One by one, people come to an age and you say, what happens then? We can keep these secrets, but will we take them to the grave?
And they're afraid because they know that Samuel McSkimmon is collecting stories, but he's a loyalist. And they find that he's collecting papers from people, but they know he's going to distort and cover it up so that he can't get it. It's an incentive. And they find a kindred spirit, an antiquarian called Richard Robert Madden, who they realize, exactly because they both oppose slavery, and he's involved in releasing slaves in various colonial contexts. They realize they have a kindred spirit, and they realize that he's sympathetic for United Irishmen, and they tell him their story, and he writes, what we call today ghost writes, the autobiography of Jamie Hope. Jamie Hope tells him the story, Madden writes it for him, they go back and forth between them, and that's how the story comes out. And so these kind of stories that come out. So sometimes these secrets have moments where they can come out, and we could be actually, from generating social forgetting, we could be regenerating tradition, and also regenerating social forgetting, because these secrets will come out, but they'll also be covered and hidden. Certain things will enter into print, certain things won't enter into print. These traditions can be passed from generation to generation, just like we pass on oral tradition, we can also pass on traditions of social forgetting. And there are moments where this regeneration will bring it out completely into the open and be completely reconfigured. These are just examples of people in the 19th century who felt so committed and impassioned to tell the story of the rebels of '98. I don't have time to deal with all of them, which is a pity. But Francis Joseph Bigger, who said, these were my ancestors. I need to collect each and every one of theirs, who traveled all around Ulster and collected their stories. These two radical women, Ethna Carberry and Alice Milligan, who collected stories specifically interested also in women's stories, because they were women with a radical journal called Sean Van Vogt. Or this gentleman on the left, Wesley Greenhill Little, was exactly what one could call folklore. He took these traditions and wrote a novel out of it. So here we have folklore, folklore. And the novel is called Betsy Gray, who was a local folk heroine. And so people look at this and say, this is just spurious. Is it? His wife comes from one of the families involved in the rebellion. He grew up in an area from the rebellion. He collects the stories, and you follow and see where he collected these stories. He readapted them, he regenerated, he retold them in a new form, and this in turn enters back into folklore. It's exactly the dynamic I talked about before. And so these moments, when this comes out into the open, you say, okay, maybe that's the end of social forgetting. And indeed, at some stage, local people who have read the novel, they knew the stories before that, but once they read the novel, they say, it really troubles us. And he writes about it in such romantic, melancholy language. At the end of the book, your woman dies there on the battlefield, and there's no grave for her. So they go and set up a monument. Huh. So out of this combination of folklore, and social forgetting and social remembrance, a monument is set up. So you'd say there's no social forgetting anymore, there's a monument. The monument is set up in advance of the centenary of 1898. Before the centenary is marked, the monument is smashed and destroyed. So this is a newspaper depiction of orange men coming and smashing it. Except when you go and listen carefully to those stories and look at them, the people who smashed the monument didn't do it because they hated the monument. They didn't want other people claiming their Betsy Gray. They didn't want these stories taken out and used by other people who are Catholic nationalists coming from Belfast on the Sabbath, which is a Presbyterian day. They've gone through an evangelical revival. They didn't want radical women coming to their very conservative area. They came and smashed the monument and kept pieces of it as souvenirs. They took the railings which were around and made horseshoes out of it and kept it at home and made souvenirs out of it. So it's about destroying and covering at the same time. This is the dynamic of social forgetting. It's not about commemorating, it's about decommemorating. And if we're talking about souvenirs, then this whole array of pictures, and I won't even dwell on this again because I realized the notion of time, but how time and time again, when folklore collectors will come to the area, there's no traditions of '98 in these areas, except that people have quite literally a pike in the thatch. Pike in the thatch is a trope in Irish nationalism of hiding the weapon for another day. But they literally have pikes from 1798. These are all Unionist, these three pictures are from Unionist communities, Loyalist communities. Some of them collected as the Troubles are about to break out. And you don't talk about these stories. Except, yes, they still hold on to the pike and the cannonball and the sword and these souvenirs, all relating to rebels from 1798. And even places like Rathlin Island, very remote area outside of Antrim, a folklore collector, Michael Murphy goes there and he asks for stories of 1798. Said, we don't have any traditions over here. He comes back a year later and somebody says, well, let me show you something that I found in my attic. We have this pike. And more traditions begin coming out slowly. He has to pry further. On his second visit, everything begins to change. So it's quite remarkable how souvenirs play into this picture. So, just to wrap it up, this whole vernacular historiography and its variety of sources which all come together. What's remarkable is that when you go back to the monument, there'll be people who can tell you how the monument was destroyed and still find traces of it after it was destroyed. So this is 82-year-old James Mills, who in 1968 could point where the monument had been because as a child he had seen it being destroyed, and give this vivid account of how people had broken it and taken pieces with them, and how the fervour happened there. People trying to claim their Betsy and not letting other people take this heroin. It's their local secret, and it's their form of social forgetting. It's about keeping it at home, but not letting other people take it from you and drag it out into the public. So that's remarkable. There he's pointing. And that's when I realized I wanted something. Because he's not the first person to do that. Here's just some good ones which I don't have pictures for, but let's just look at this. Here's somebody in 1939 finding the piece of the stone. And here's James Mills as he shows it. Here's somebody in 1976. People are going around each time uncovering the case. And this fascinated me. Before I even had the full picture as a student working on the first book, I began to pick up on these traces, saying this is something which I've got to research one day, but I just want to go and see the place. So I go over with a map outside Ballynahinch to where this act happened, where this woman, Betsy Gray, was killed by soldiers together with her lover and her brother. They flee the battlefield, they're hunted down by yeomanry, and they're killed on this hill, as tradition tells it. And that's where the monument was supposed to be. The monument was supposed to be smashed and long gone. And I'm walking around there, and it's all covered in bushes, and it's a wild area, and it doesn't take long till somebody comes up to me. And this is John Somerville, who comes up, is it this you're looking for? And he pushes it aside and finds the two stones. And he begins to recite a poem. And I said, I haven't heard that poem. I said, of course you haven't. My uncle wrote it. And there's other poems which are being generated here. This was a poem which was written, if I have another sermon, we deal just with that. It's a poem which was written during the height of the Troubles. It's a poem in a loyalist community which celebrates a rebel, a Republican rebel, of Protestants fighting together with Catholics against British rule in a community which is strongly loyalist. It's DUP today, which is extreme loyalist. So the whole poem celebrates it, at the same time covers her memory every time, and in the end adds a caveat which says, well, all this was wrong anyway, wasn't it? It's almost like a guarantee way of saying, we're marking this memory, but we want to make sure that people don't finger us for this. It's dangerous material. And that's how social forgetting works. And the only way to actually get to this, we saw the sources are all over. They're in the archive, they're in popular print, they're published as pictures, there's stones and souvenirs and houses. But the only way we need to get to it in the end is to come back to what we began with. Folklore fieldwork in the end pays back. And then it is about going there. It is about collecting these historical oral traditions. So yes, folk history is at the center of vernacular historiography, but it's part of a much larger picture.
Thank you very much, Guy. I found that deeply moving, having spent 4 years, not years, in Northern Ireland myself, and the faces and also that very ambivalence. Really, anybody who knows the North knows what it's like. I think this raised probably many questions, and let's have a few questions. If you have to leave, please leave, but I want to give you the chance to pose a few questions to Professor Beiner, if he is willing. Great.
Your idea of social forgetting seems to have tremendous relevance to the contemporary controversy in Dublin over the commemoration of the Royal Irish Constabulary.
Of course.
I don't know if you're following that.
I am, very much so.
I mean, it seems directly there, and you don't have to work as hard to find the sources on how people are trying to forget their ancestors' involvement.
For those who don't know, so let's clue people in quickly, there was a furore. You can follow it by going into the Irish Times online. I brought it to a classroom of mine the other week in Boston. There was a furore recently when the government decided that they're going to hold a commemoration marking the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary, which would be the police during the War of Irish Independence. Now these are the police who are policing against the revolutionaries. But let's also remember, these police were Irish. Right? These are not British soldiers. It's not marking the British soldiers, it's marking the Irish policemen. And this caused a huge political furore, and then the government went back on it, and it's been back and forth. Should it be? We won't even go into that, except that you're right, this is particularly relevant. Whether you need to dig just as much to see where the traditions are remembered. What about families? Every family, many times families have mixed memories. In the same family, there'd be somebody who's a member of the RIC and a member of the IRA.
Right, yep.
How do you negotiate that in a family? That's what we need to peel. That's never been done properly. And so all of this work is there. The more I think about it, we've always gone over after the English would say the bleeding obvious. We deserve prizes in academia for going after the bleeding obvious. It's always obvious. It's always like the parable of the person looking for their keys under the spotlight, isn't it? You lose your keys after you walk out of a place, and you go to where the light is, because the keys must be there. There's light there. Yeah. The keys are in the dark somewhere, but we don't have a flashlight, so we don't go to look in the dark. It's always that problem, is we've gone after collective memory. I don't like the word collective memory. But we go after the obvious, the ceremonies, the monuments, the open places. There's plenty of study to be done there. But always there's these stories of social forgetting in every society. Definitely in every nation, but it's also beyond nations, communities. There's always dark secrets. On a national scale, on a regional scale, on a personal scale. And Ireland is full of dark secrets, which are coming out at the moment in recent years on all scales, on domestic levels and on religious levels. And yes, how do you deal with that? And how is it negotiated over this time? It's not that people were never aware of it. And so we need to pay attention. We need to do folklore of silences. Please.
Yeah, I actually had very similar experience recently. I went back in 2016 and I was doing some oral history regarding Matt Fitzpatrick. It was a song that I collected about this IRA sort of martyr. The story is, it's still contested history, but I did get to talk to some of the extended family of Matt Fitzpatrick, and I also sought to talk to Protestants, and but that didn't end up quite as, but anyway, so a friend of mine who was Protestant, but who was also very much interested in local history, said, I would like to give the paper that you presented, I gave it a paper in Limerick. This should be published. There's a periodical called the Fermanagh Miscellany, and but they did not want to touch it. It was still even, and I guess the person that had communicated with Florence was Catholic, but they absolutely did not want to touch this paper, so it didn't happen. So I just thought it was kind of interesting that after all, and again, it also seemed a little bit a bit of an oxymoron, because this was 2016, so this was also during the time when 1916 was being commemorated to a very great extent on the border. So.
Well, that's exactly, I think, in the way the point, and that's why it's not for nothing that I chose. I've studied social forgetting in various contexts on various scales, but in this book I spent a great deal of time on this book, for more than a decade. And the point was that this book allowed me also the perspective, allowed me breadth. It allowed me to look over social forgetting and the history of it for more than 2 centuries. And then you realize that there's openings and closings. There's moments where things can appear in print, and there's moments where they can't appear in print. The contexts are crucial. The fact that it's 2016 might be particularly sensitive at certain times. At other times it might be less sensitive. Sometimes it's a reaction to excess commemoration and you want to take a step back. All these things have to be dealt with carefully. And so putting it within a historiography, vernacular historiography, gives us a bigger kind of zoom out picture sometimes.
Okay, maybe 1 or 2 short questions, John?
This is a very simple question. You mentioned Brexit, and
Yeah.
I'm wondering if your research opens up any possibilities for a Northern Ireland exit from Brexit, connection back to the other counties.
Yeah.
Wouldn't we love that? Things never work as the political scientists would like it to work, though identities are constantly being floated and negotiated long before Brexit, during Brexit. Brexit usually is actually an entrenchment moment where people dig deeper in. The Republican dream always was that if you scratch the loyalists a little deep, you'll find actually Republicans in the closet. And the more they played on that, the more it infuriated people who actually dug deeper into social forgetting, refused then to acknowledge even more. So perhaps one of the biggest incentives for dynamics of social forgetting was Catholic claiming of these traditions. And from the 19th century, from the late 19th century onwards, the more Catholic nationalists claimed these traditions. That, by the way, is part of the dynamic of the smashing of the monument we saw there. The monument was built by local people, but it's the nationalists of Belfast who decided to come and celebrate it on the Sabbath. So it can work both ways in different moments. In other moments, it's even been a voice for a third voice. Ulster Scots saying, we don't want to be part of this thing. It's a whole kind of Ulster Scots dynamic, saying we're actually connected to Scotland. And we're not part of this whole story, we have our own identity, which is an Ulster identity, which is of course hugely offensive to Irish nationalists, because what do you mean an Ulster identity? And it's issues here. So it just complicates things, and Brexit is another aggravating context which changes with time, and one which you really don't know where it will go. Nobody knows, including your man who's governing it here.
True. One last quick question. There's no one volunteering, then I can always come back to the falafels. Which are waiting for us, not far from here, my friends. So please, anybody who has even the littlest spot of hunger after this wonderful intellectual piece, think about topping that up with a little falafel. So let me ask you to very warmly thank Rabbi for this splendid